Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show, Science, Facts, and Fallacies podcast. My name is Cameron English. That's Dr. Liza Dunn. Liza, what's going on?
Hello. Not much. Just got back from a trip. It was a good trip. I met people from Africa and from Nepal and all over the place. It was wonderful.
Your life is so much more interesting than mine. I'm just here in the suburbs, and Liza's like, oh, I met these people from Africa, and I went to this other side of the world. I'm like, well, I'm just here in my house.
No, you'll get there. You'll get there. Raising babies is the most important thing.
It's true. It's true. I love it. And I'm quite happy that my life is boring because there's all kinds of chaos, which is terrific. But
That's all right.
we're going to do something a little bit different today. We just got off our most recent space, and we talked about organic farming and the contrast between that growing system and conventional agriculture as it relates to climate change. So people have heard a lot about the fact that the world is warming, perhaps not as quickly or as severely as we were told, but nevertheless it is warming, and that does have an impact on food production. And so we need to figure out how we grow enough food for everyone as the planet warms. And so there's been some interesting research, and we wanted to tackle that, but then we also wanted to get the perspective of people that grow our food, namely farmers. Because
That's
everyone
right.
seems to have an opinion on food and nutrition. Most people don't know what they're talking about, but they get a platform, right? They write best-selling books, and everyone takes them seriously, even though they're dead wrong. So that's what we're trying to combat with the space. And it was great. There were some perspectives that I didn't expect necessarily, but there was a lot of insight, at least that I gained.
Me too.
What did
Me
you
too.
think? What did you think, Liza?
Yeah, I thought I'm obviously a city dweller. I have a little bit of experience with my grandmother being raising cattle and having some land out in the rural area, but I don't have firsthand experience farming, and so it's we in the city and we doctors like to write a bunch of prescriptions for how farming should be. And I think it's really critically important to talk to the experts about what should happen with farming because they know best. And I think that there are lots of different perspectives of how to do it right and how to do it the best. And the question is, how do you do it with the least environmental footprint? And how do you scale it up so you can feed 10 billion people by 2050? And that's a real challenge. And I think we're going to have all sorts of, especially because most of the people who are farming globally now are subsistence farmers in the developing world. And so it's very easy in the West, where we have lots of really good support for our farmers. And actually, the farmers may disagree with that claim, but relatively speaking, lots more support for those farmers than there are for the subsistence farmers who are just trying to eke out an existence.
Yeah, the impetus for the space was an article published by the Breakthrough Institute. If you want to read it, everyone, it's called "Will Climate Change Starve Us All? No, but Bad Science Communication and Fear Mongering Might." Great headline. This is by Alex Smith, who is the editorial director at the Breakthrough Institute. They're awesome, by the way. Very thoughtful, very science-based commentary and research on all these kinds of questions that we investigate. And my daughter just dropped her pacifier. That was terribly helpful. In any case, just some good news, because when we talk about food, we talk about a lot of scary stuff, right? We're running out of food. We have 60 harvests left because the soil is poison. Your vegetables are turning into sugar, a la Scientific American. But some good news. So this is from this article, and Alex points out, he says, the past half century has seen about 1 degree Celsius in global warming, and yet agricultural output globally has increased almost fourfold over the same period. And then he says this increase in output is responsible for the prevention of more than 3 billion hectares of land being converted into agricultural land, about a quarter of the world's total arable land. So that's enormous, right? When you talk about, or when you hear people talk about conventional agriculture or corporate agriculture or industrial, blah, 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 like whatever negative adjective you use to describe big farming, it's always negative, right? It's,
That's right.
the poor piggies are being tortured, the poor chickens are being stuffed in cages, et cetera, et cetera. And in reality, all of these developments, synthetic pesticides, fertilizers, mechanization, um, the digital revolution, AI, all of this stuff is having a huge benefit. We're feeding more people. We have access to more food. And I think, if I'm being blunt, I think that was sort of glossed over during our space. So
I agree.
we had a handful of people who are organic growers, and they were sharing a lot of insight about, how do you control weeds when you can't use herbicides? Because there's no, to my knowledge, there's no, at least on the market right now, there's no organic approved weed killers. So you have to have different approaches for controlling weeds. And so they were talking about how they do that, and they're talking about fertilizing your crops without synthetic nitrogen and so forth. There's really interesting stuff, but none of them really got to the fact that these technological developments that they're not allowed to use, or that they prohibit themselves from using,
Mm-hmm.
it's revolutionary. I mean, you know,
Yes,
yeah,
the Haber-Bosch process is the reason, which is how you make fertilizer. It's the reason why 50% of the world's population is able to survive. It's arguably the most important advance in agriculture in the whole history of agriculture, and it's fertilizer is one of these issues that people have all sorts of angst about because of runoff and anoxic zones in water and things like that. But by the same token, the trade-off, and I'm not saying that fertilizer is perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but the trade-off is that you and your children survive. And so I think it's important to recognize the benefit that this particular process has had, and then figure out how to uh, do it with as little environmental impact as possible. And there are ways that people are discovering to make it more and more possible to achieve the same kind of um, explosive growth of crops with a really, really decreased land need for it. And if we could get around the conundrum of fertilizer, I think we would be able to do some pretty amazing stuff. And as a matter of fact, um, there there's potential to do that. Not just with cover crops and legumes, adding actual nitrogen into the soil and fixing nitrogen, and biologics that people are exploring for doing that. But there are ways to maybe potentially genetically modify crops to be able to produce the environment around their roots that would make fertilizer unnecessary. So a couple of years ago, scientists found it's corn growing at an altitude that they'd never expected to see it at in Mexico. And when they dug up the corn, they found this very thick gel around its roots. And it turned out that this corn had a genetic predisposition to forming this gel, which actually was able to fix nitrogen. And so you could if you could take that gene that makes that possible for that corn to do that, you could genetically modify other plants to get a very environmentally rich source of nitrogen where you don't need to have fertilizer in such great quantities. I think there's also this whole romantic notion about animal fertilizer. We've been using animal fertilizer for millennia, and animals and manure are very, very important for that. But there are things that have to go with that. If you're going to depend entirely on animals for fertilizer, so you can have your organic crops, you need a lot more animals, and then you need a lot more plants to feed those animals to make that possible. And then you also need to deal with pathogens and make sure that the pathogens aren't contaminating your crops and getting large populations sick. So there's a lot of there's a lot of real science, I think, in sort of biologics, and I think that the future of agriculture is going to really go along with our increasing understanding around biologics. But there's also the reality that you've got to be able to scale these things up. The biologics can't be pathologic, And these biologics also make chemistry. They make chemicals that uh, help survival. And so bacteria, fungi, plants make their own pesticides, and they're Mother Nature's pesticides. And what we've done with in the conventional agricultural world is largely taken the backbone from Mother Nature and built on that to make pesticides. So the notion of chemicals being toxic and bad and evil and this, that, and the other is a little misguided, because plants and or microorganisms do the same thing, and it's all about survival of the fittest.
You know, you asked a very insightful question of one of the gentlemen, and it was simple. You just said, okay, and you were very respectful. It was great, but you said, so with these techniques you're talking about, how do you feed a city like New York? And then you said, wait, take it back. How do you feed Manhattan, just that borough? And his answer was, I think, more revealing than he intended. And he said, well, the way you do that is you make people grow their own food. Is in essence is what he said, right? He said
That's right.
he didn't say every single person needs to grow their own food, but he said you need to recruit more people into farming, and the way that Manhattan is organized right now just can't go on. Was basically his answer. And I think that's interesting, because when we talk about this issue, the point we're always getting at is there's this many people, there's going to be this many people, and how do we make sure no one goes hungry without destroying our natural resources?
That's right.
And what I heard from his answer was, well, you just need to adapt to the way that I want you to live. Is basically what he was saying. At least that's what I took away. And I think that's the opposite extreme of the other one we critique, right? A lot of these NGOs, when they talk about climate or any kind of pollution, the answer is always, well, we'll just crowd everyone into these 15-minute cities, and we'll dictate we'll dictate every aspect of your life, and you will like it because you don't have another choice. And I heard him saying more or less the same thing, just in the opposite direction. He's like, well, all you have to do is move out of the city and fundamentally change your lifestyle, and don't worry, we're going to help you, right?
We're going to help you all be subsistence farmers. And
Right.
I think that once again, I think the city is really at the mercy of the rural population, but the rural population is dwindling, and there's once again, there's all sorts of romanticization of how farming should be, and very few people who actually are doing real subsistence farming. And so, like I said earlier, in terms of how do you deal with, it's one thing if you're in the north or in the like southern hemisphere, where at latitudes where you have winter, and winter is a wonderful equalizer of insect pest pressure and weed pest pressure. But if you're in the tropics in any way, shape, or form, your environment is completely different, and so you may need more inputs to be as productive as you can. And unfortunately, people in the tropics are at a much higher risk of, you know, of food insecurity and malnutrition and things like that. So it's very easy for us to be experimental with our farming, because at the end of the day, we have full grocery stores. But it's much harder for people with intense pest pressure, 365 days a year, 24/7, to be able to to save their smallholder farms. And I think that we don't think about that. We're very privileged in the way we think about farming in the West, and we don't face the same kind of obstacles that subsistence farmers do. So it's much easier for us to experiment because our lives aren't dependent on our crop that we're growing on an acre, whereas this is their livelihood and their food security. And so it's much more survival of the fittest in those situations. And so we've got the luxury of being able to dabble in a variety of different farming techniques.
Yeah, I don't know if you said this just a minute ago, but the context of that facet of the discussion was he was talking about how they do all these great things where they don't have to use synthetic pesticides, and they don't need synthetic fertilizer. Right? We have this natural, holistic sort of a way to grow food. And then you asked him, well, okay, but what about in the tropics? And
Yeah.
his answer was, well, I mean, that's nature too, right? You don't have pests destroying forests, but you do. And I was driving, so I couldn't really chime in.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know as much about the Amazon, but I know in Canada, for example, one of the reasons that they had really intense wildfires last year is because there's insects that eat the
Hmm.
trees.
Hmm.
They eat the trees, they kill them, and then once they're dead, it's just dry matter that burns,
That's right.
right? And
Kindling.
totally natural, totally holistic. There's no one growing corn in
Mm-mm.
these forests up in Canada, but there's bugs and they eat the trees.
Yep.
Um, and I know I don't. Again, I'm not going to speak directly about the Amazon, but I know in Florida, for example, which is much more tropical, there are environmental groups. I forget the one, but there are environmental groups down there. They go out into the Everglades or wherever. They
Hmm.
spray glyphosate because there's invasive weeds out there that
Hmm.
will kill the local flora and fauna, and so they spray glyphosate to keep these invasive
Weeds
weeds in
at
check.
bay.
Right.
Yeah.
And interestingly, again, there may be some agriculture. There's probably not a ton, but the point is, it's a totally natural environment,
Hmm.
and you're still using synthetic chemicals down there. So I think it's not that he was totally off base, because I'm sure there are some growers that are in those environments that use some of those techniques, but it's too simplistic. I thought it's like I don't know how to put it. It's like they're very wedded to their ideas, and I totally get that. Lots of people are. I'm like
Hmm.
that, just like most people. But I I don't know. It just seemed like there was an unwillingness to confront the realities,
Hmm.
and yeah.
And I think that they're largely successful farmers as well, and they've got access to things. Some of the farmers were saying that they will use pesticides if they need to. It's not 100% organic. That we're learning more and more about the soil microbiome, and we're learning more and more about proteomics and all of that stuff. But that science is really nascent science, and it's important to be able to fall back on the tools that you have to prevent you from losing your crop if while you're learning this other stuff. And I think that a couple of them admitted that's the case, that they will go back and rely. They're not totally pesticide free, um, and they will go back and rely on certain pesticides if necessary. But I think that the pest pressure in the developing world is far more intense than it is in our country. And I think in our country, we are the beneficiaries of a whole lot of science that's been able to make us be as productive as we are. I mean, once again, and I think I started out the space with this in 1900. 45% of our population farmed, and they were largely subsistence farmers, and that got us into the Dust Bowl in the late 20s and early 30s, where they were so aggressive about tilling because the weeds had such incredible pressure on the crops that they wound up really damaging the soil, and you wound up with these big dust storms where the topsoil was getting blown away. And it had originally started out as very fertile uh, ground for crops. And so I think that we learned from that, and we continue to learn. But it doesn't take away the fact that the situation in agriculture, when you're dependent on 2% of your population to feed you, and then you are making the rules for how they feed you without having any kind of concept of the fragility of that ecosystem, um, it's fraught, and you have to be very careful about the things that you wish for, because no good deed goes unpunished.
I was going to ask at one point during the space. So, do you want organic farming like post 2015? Is that what we're advocating? Because that's never the message that you hear, right? It's always that
That's right.
it's always been better. And you guys, speaking of the big seed and chemical companies, you guys screwed it all up because people are hooked on your products, and and they're not even that profitable anyway. that was always the argument. But what they seem to be saying is this stuff is so awesome that everybody needs to use it. But I didn't get a chance to ask. I'm like, okay, so if we go back 20 years, should
Yeah, what's
everyone
your cutoff?
yeah, should everyone still have been growing conventionally? I don't know. I just and again, I made the point very clearly when we were talking. There's a market for that. If there's a market for those inputs they're using, if other farmers want to use them, great.
Yeah,
And if they can sell, if people want to buy their stuff because they think it confers some benefit on them, great.
so be it. Yeah,
Right.
I'm all for people being able to choose what they want to buy and not regulating, micromanaging in terms of regulation, absolutely every aspect of farming. Yeah, that people should, if they want to have organic, then fine, they can buy organic. If they want to have gene edited because that's really cool science and it's saving the planet, it's saving the banana, it's saving a variety of different things. So that's environmentally important. Then they have at that too. But I don't think that there is one right answer. And throwing out the baby with the bathwater for pure, just organic farming is, I think, highly romanticized uh, pipe dream. And if you look at Sri Lanka, we've seen that, right? Once again, we've had 10,000 years of experience with organic farming and 50 years of food security in the West. And I think that farmers in the global South should have access to the same tools, and they should be able to choose. They should have access to the same tools that have lifted us out of poverty, because subsistence farming is a grinding lifestyle that really relegates you to poverty. Conventional farming and then modern agriculture have been able to lift people out of that poverty, so the true professionals that want to do this as a profession, that are very savvy in terms of the science and the business and the productivity of all of this, should have the option of making the decision that that's the way they want to farm. Otherwise, we're all I can't imagine the people that I know in Manhattan very well actually being successful farmers enough to feed themselves. I know I probably would have a hard time growing a head of lettuce. I can resuscitate people off the street, but that's because a farmer feeds me.
1 second, I'm having a
That's okay.
having a crisis.
That's okay. All right, but yeah, no, I think that that's the problem, is that you've got far too many people who think that because they can grow a little vegetable plot on a rooftop, that they can therefore translate that into a scaling up uh, capacity that's actually not true. I think it's very important for people to figure out how to feed themselves and how to, do gardening and things like that. It gets you a sense of how hard it is to do this, but you're not going to be able to feed Manhattan with the carrots you grow on your rooftop. And if the carrots fail, they're going to fail you. And if that's your only source of food, that's a big problem. And I don't think that people are making that connection. They think, oh, I can grow a couple tomatoes, I can grow a couple carrots, and that's going to sustain me. Um, I'm not so sure.
Yeah, you die, as with
Yeah,
most people. And again, going back in
me too.
time,
I would. Yeah.
most people did die. We were
Mm-hmm.
talking last week about how the life expectancy used to be 50.
Mm-hmm.
That's crazy. I mean, there was a time in history where if you got a cut on your finger, you could get infected and die.
And you'd be dead. That's
Yeah,
exactly right.
yeah. All that to say, the division of labor is really important. Like it's great that you're a doctor because you excel at that. And it's great that other people sell insurance because we need insurance. And some people
Mm-hmm.
farm and some people, make light bulbs, whatever, right? This is what a civilization is. It's people dividing their labor and exchanging goods and services and building communities. I don't know. I just that tends to get overlooked. The other thing that it's always gotten under my skin is somebody said, people eat all of these food products as a way to say, well, you eat food products and I grow food. I'm like, well, the
Right.
stuff in the grocery store, you could call it a product, I suppose, but it's still food.
Yep.
It's still composed of nutrients. It's calories. And that was so strange to me. It's like, it's the abundance isn't the problem, right? It's that we live in a world where people don't have to expend calories, right? You just, I work from this desk, and if I don't get up and go exercise, no one's gonna make me.
That's right.
And I can get on my phone, I can go, I'd like a burrito, right? And it just comes to my door. I mean, so in
That's
other
right.
words, it's the misuse of those amenities. That's the problem, right?
And people don't realize how luxurious that is in the whole realm of things. That's, I mean, once again, that has, for millennia, people farmed and farmed and farmed and toiled away, digging, scratching in the dirt to try to grow enough to feed their families and themselves. And now all of a sudden it's there, and that is incredibly luxurious, and we take it for granted.
Yeah, we'll have to do another one where we ask some of these questions. Another thing I wanted to ask, because I posted an article in the space about this pioneer within agroecology, which is what they all espouse, right?
Hmm.
We practice agroecology, not just organic farming, but agroecology,
Agroecology.
right? Which it's very loosely defined. There's, people can call it whatever they want, basically.
Hmm.
Um, but what I wanted to ask, because this gentleman endorsed gene editing. He said, I'd grow CRISPR edited crops, even though
Hmm.
I'm an agroecological grower or whatever. And his point was, enhancing the genetics of the plant is not a big deal, right? The thing that we're concerned about is the growing method. What
Hmm.
inputs are you using? We don't want to use synthetic chemicals. Is basically what it comes down to.
That's right.
But I wanted to ask them about that because they're so fascinated about the microbes that live in the soil, and all this biology is so beautiful and nature is just so brilliant, but there's genetics underlying all of that, right? All these living things, like this nitrogen, this little film that they can produce, like that's encoded in their DNA, right?
That's right.
So I would love to know, okay, well, if we can breed a variety of corn that's disease resistant, or a tomato with more vitamin D. I mean, that's a thing.
Yep.
Would you be okay with that? Like, if you could grow that organically or agroecologically or what would
However you would do it.
right?
Yeah.
I would like to know because I think that would clue us into what their concerns really are. Are their concerns, you know what I mean?
And there, the same kind of thing goes with chemistry, right? So there's all sorts of concerns about tinkering with evolution by tinkering with DNA. But there are also all sorts of concerns about chemicals and chemistry. And once again, plants make their own pesticides. And those pesticides that they make are not benign necessarily. I mean, if you think about apple seeds and peach pits, they have their own seed treatment, Mother Nature seed treatment that's probably a lot more toxic than the seed treatments that we put on seeds, right, to protect the seeds. So we're taking sort of some of the science from Mother Nature to do that. And we're trying to make it as low toxicity as possible for mammals and the environment. But, if you look at cassava, if you don't prepare it correctly, the skin produces cyanide. And you can wind up dead from cyanide poisoning if you don't prepare it properly. And that's because this particular plant, which is very useful and as a staple crop for many developing countries because it's easy to grow, it's very easy to manage, but it has its own pesticide in the skin. It protects it from rodents eating it because they die of cyanide poisoning. And so Mother Nature has a lot of her own pesticides encoded in those genes, and those pesticides are often much more toxic than any pesticide, and in higher concentrations than any pesticide we would ever put on a plant. And so it's all relative, and the dose makes the poison, and it's really important to think about these things critically.
Are you saying nature didn't run field trials
No,
before tobacco
no,
plants started producing nicotine?
that, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. Yes, and what the crazy thing is, a lot of these things that are in plants to protect them. And I'm going to say animals too, like venoms and snakes, right? We've used snake venom to make antihypertensive medicines. We've used Gila monster venom to make anti-diabetic medicines. And that's because of the properties of the venom have some pretty significant pharmacologic effects that we've found to be useful. So one man's poison may be another man's medicine and maybe a pesticide to protect a plant or an animal from predation. And I think that that's a really important One Health notion to kind of think critically about before we throw the baby out with the bathwater. Chemistry is life.
Chemistry rules.
Chemistry rules.
This microphone I'm talking into, I mean, without fossil fuels, this just wouldn't exist. This is like, multiple polymers. There's all kinds of like really expensive minerals and metals. And you know what I mean? Like,
That's right.
It's just all around you. So even if you were to convert to this, regenerative, agroecological, organic, all natural,
Technically, plastic is all organic. It's a bunch of hydrocarbons.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
It's organic.
And unpopular opinion, it's quite sustainable as a material.
It is.
It really is. I'd love to have that discussion with somebody. It's an amazing, it's amazing material. And there's different kinds. But nevertheless, I don't know. I don't know how to put it. As we wrap up here, I don't know. There's just this special magic, like this holy natural dirt. Is like I don't know. We give it a halo, and I don't understand, because life would just really suck without all of these chemistries. It just really would. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It just I don't know.
I would not trade my existence in the 20th and 21st century for an existence in the 1800s. I think that I am the beneficiary of such incredible science and such a wonderful lifestyle that I think that we're very misguided in romanticizing the past.
Yeah. Well said. All right, we'll leave it there. Short episode today, just a space recap. Go listen to that discussion. Obviously, we have strong opinions on this, but there was a lot of insight. There's some cool things going on. Like they were talking about studies that you do to analyze the nutrients in a crop, right? Like the way you grow the crop, how does that affect the nutrient quality of the food? It's really interesting stuff. There's a lot of good things going on, and we can mix and match, as you were saying a minute ago, right? Take the best, combine it, use what's right for your situation.
It's and go from there.
There you go.
We're all in this together.
Yeah. And no one yelled at each other, screamed at each other, and it was fine. Yep. Come join us usually every Friday at 11 a.m. Central Time. This was an exception because Liza was doing her doctor thing, having to go talk about medicine with other doctors. But come to the next one. Follow us on Twitter. It's at Dr. Liza MD. I am at Cam J English. Thank you so much. We'll see you all next time.
Have a good week.